From CGTN headquarters in Beijing, this is The Hub with Wang Guan.
Hello and welcome to The Hub. I'm Wang Guan. The U.S. House of Representatives has just passed the America Competes Act of 2022. The stated goal of this act is to bolster its manufacturing, R&D, and reduce its dependence on Chinese semiconductors. The bill includes a $52 billion package to support the country's chip industry, while $45 billion have been earmarked for supply chains. Earlier, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi said the bill would, quote-unquote, supercharge investment in chips as well as advance U.S. competitiveness and leadership. For more on this bill, we're joined in Washington, D.C. today by Sourabh Gupta, head of the Trade and Tech Program at the Institute for China-America Studies. In Beijing, we're joined by Qu Qiang, Assistant Director and Fellow of the International Monetary Institute at Renmin University. Welcome, gentlemen. Sourabh, let me go to you. Before America Competes Act of 2022 was introduced, the Senate passed the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act, otherwise known as USICA, in 2021. How different are these two bills?
There's actually quite a lot of difference, and that's also creating a lot of dissension in Washington, D.C. There's a core part in this bill which is complementary, which is, as you mentioned, the CHIPS Act and funding for the CHIPS Act. But the Senate had passed the bill on a bipartisan basis, and they had involved things like something within USICA, which was an umbrella legislation. They had things like Strategic Competition Act, the Endless Frontier Act, and this was passed on a bipartisan basis. In the House, they passed completely separate legislation which did not parallel that legislation, and it was passed on a purely partisan basis. And now this has created a problem because the bills now need to be conferenced, that means reconciled, and if it needs to then pass the Senate, there needs to be at least 60 votes. So they need to get 10 Republicans. So some of the matter issues in the Competes Act will need to be stripped out of the conference. So it's still in a very, very complicated phase, I would say.
Right. Qu Qiang, what do you think regarding the future, the political future of this bill, and also how would you compare this bill with the bill that's passed last year? How are the two bills complementing each other?
Well, I think the two bills reflecting the changes in the different opinions of the bipartisan opinions. One difference is in the money spent, no matter it's about its amount or the area it's going to be spent. The second one is about its range. It's going to cover what kind of range? It's going to be focused on economic topics, or it's going to be a package covering both economic issues, trade issues, and also the political issues. So basically, we're seeing the Democrat and the Republicans have different opinion over this. The Senate is basically having a more balanced opinion over this, but the Congress basically are more radical. They want the whole bill to goes to another extreme, to be more with a bigger leap forward. And I think this bill's reflecting there's still a very, very big difference of opinions among the Senate and the Congress.
So when you talk about these differences, Sourabh, talk to us about the political division in Washington, D.C. Even though the Democrats and the Republicans are pretty much on board with the idea of confronting and competing with China, they have different ideas about how to go about doing this, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely correct about that. There's a division across the aisle and a division across chambers in the manner they want to. There's common cause in terms of competing and confronting China. And that, in terms of this bill, we're talking mainly in the technology and the economic areas. But because the House is by the Democrats, Senator Pelosi, she wants to tack on a lot of other items which are really radioactive to the Republicans, things like climate change related stuff, things like worker related issues. You know, there's a very comprehensive trade section within this bill where there's a lot of goodies for kind of left-leaning audiences, which she can then take. So what Speaker Pelosi has done is use this competition tendencies vis-a-vis China and utilize that while leaving some of the core competition issues there, also utilize this bill as a vehicle to push a lot of the rest of her political agenda. And that is the issue which is creating problems. And the Republicans are really not going to stand, because at this point of time, if you see in the House at least, no Republican has voted for the Competes Act. And obviously they don't get a chance to vote on what passes in the Senate. So at this point of time, House Republicans have voted for nothing. And there is going to be a good deal of division in terms of how do we reconcile matters between the two chambers.
Right, really, Qu Qiang, that leads to my next question. Is this bill really all about China or competing with China, or do U.S. politicians just want to use China as a rallying point to build back America, to push forward America's domestic agendas?
Well, yes, I do think you have asked a very good question. No, my answer is it's not all about China. It's more about China. It's more about the rest of the world besides USA and China. But also it's more about China. It's because it's try to bring in the Republicans, keep them in line. And that's the idea of the Democrat. The whole idea is that the Democrats always want to do this. They want to compete. They want to keep the dominance in both for America and the world. But how can they do this if they're just trying to do the tricks on the trade and the economic issues? They violated their own purpose, the free trade and the liberal economy. So how can I compete with China and the other potential competitors, but still under the framework of the free trade and also liberalism? So their idea is to form alliance. But how they form alliance? I think the answer is ideology. So they have to put some other string attached, like so-called freedom, like the human rights, and also some other westernized human values, something like that. So they can keep the other alliance in line. So they're seeing, okay, we're doing this not only because of the cost and efficiency or the benefit, but we're doing this for something good. There is air quote. And also, they have to fight the other competitors inside of their country, the Republicans. So the Republicans also want to compete with them in the earmarks, in the budget, and all the other topics. So how they can bring them in line? The same value. Okay, you have to do this out of a bigger picture. You have to do this out of the human rights, freedom, and etc. So this become a very good excuse. So you're seeing, now you understand why it's not only about China.
Right, but at the end of the day, this bill, as many economists would point out, is, to a large extent, a grand piece of industrial policy, something the United States, which is the world's largest capitalist free market countries, or one of the largest at least, is loath to use. I mean, if you think about it, Washington heavily criticized China back then about China's Made in China 2025 industrial plan, right? So with Competes Act and USICA Act, does America bring back industrial policy to the fore? How do you feel about all this, Sarah?
Yeah, I think this is industrial policy literally brought to the fore, and brought in a way that has not been brought for the past 8 decades, ever since the end of the Great Depression. The United States is generally going in a more interventionist and activist way in industrial policy. Now, the problem has arisen that they really haven't done much industrial policy for a long time. Don't get me wrong out here. There has been industrial policy. You know, when NASA sends things up in space in the 1960s, that was purely government funded. It was not private funded. And the U.S. has quietly been making markets. U.S. government has quietly been making markets where then private competition plays. And I think Silicon Valley is the best example. But the fundamental point is that the U.S. has not done industrial policy in a muscular way for a long time. And that requires certain processes. It requires little kind of pipelines to push your agenda through. It requires an infrastructure, processes, and they don't have that kind of bureaucratic infrastructure to be able to really put that in shape. And therefore, the question is, yes, you can put a lot of money towards industrial policy goals, will that ultimately reach the purpose to which it is intended to, or will that money get diverted elsewhere, or is it going to have duplication, etc.? And that's the big thing we need to find, because many of these investments are useful so long as they're productive, but they need to be put to productive use, and it is not certain that government can actually get that money put to productive use in the implementation processes.
Yeah, Qu Qiang, what do you think about the utility, the effectiveness, efficacy of America's industrial policy? Because when you look at back in the 1980s, when Japan was outcompeting America in many fronts, America also rolled out a massive industrial plan or plans to rival Japan. How useful do you think America's industrial policy is going to be this time around vis-a-vis China?
Well, I think time has changed. Back in the 1970s and 80s, Japan was the rivalry of America's economy, and they're fighting in the frontier of the automobile industry, manufacturing. And at that time, Democrats and Republicans' benefit are the same. They're helping the voters, they're helping American economy, and basically they're helping the big industry, covering a large number of the workers and etc. So their benefit are actually the same. But right now, if you look at the competition between China and America, you will find, well, it's different, because we're fighting not only in the low-end manufacturing, but more in the high-end and the top tax. And for America, this industry only benefit a very, very small proportion of the population, of the workforce. Well, to be more specific, you're only helping the two Bay Areas, the San Jose and also the Back Bay Area and Boston. But for the voters, for the Republicans, for the lots of blue-collar workers in the Middle West regions, this kind of plan is not helpful. You just take a look at the former like the high-speed rail plan by the Biden administration. This was nowhere, even though it has been planning for many, many years. So I'm thinking this time it's going to be quite different, because it's not only the competition between China and America, but also it's more of the competition between the two forces within America.
Right. Domestic politics certainly play a huge role when it comes to affecting the course of a country's foreign policy. Sourabh, let me go back to you. The chip industry is once again back in focus. It has apparently become the new battleground between Beijing and Washington. What do strong semiconductors, R&D capabilities really mean for the future of China-U.S. relations and their competition?
Oh, I think it means everything for the future of U.S.-China competition, strategic competition. Semiconductors is the foundation on which many of these incredible applications or incredible products work, and therefore it's essential that in semiconductor manufacturing at the highest nodes that one has specialization and has capability. And to America's credit, they've been a leader in semiconductor design and up to a point manufacturing for a very long period of time. They've lost that capability in semiconductor manufacturing because it was outsourced, and that's why you're seeing so much CHIPS money, etc., to recreate semiconductor production capabilities. But America has always been a leader in semiconductor design and in design tools. And frankly, my question to the Americans would be, you are really good at it and you do it through private means. Why do you need government money to do it? Because you already have a leg up in that regard. So yes, this is foundationally very, very important for U.S.-China relations. And this is one area, there are brilliant applications and brilliant creativity and innovation in China happening at this point of time. But these build on foundational technologies where China still has certain weaknesses. And therefore, it is the U.S. is using that weakness, at least for a temporary period of time, to try to inflict as much damage or suppress China's capabilities so as to enlarge the gap. I don't think that's the way it's going to work, but that is the motivation behind so much of these technology control policies which have been imposed on China, is to attack China's relative lack of foundational and scientific instrumentation capabilities, not its immense creativity in developing applications which build over those foundational technologies. So we'll have to see how this plays out, but semiconductors, all said and done, very, very important. We'll be talking about this 10 years hence also.
Right. Thank you for all these perspectives regarding, semiconductor and how it positions in the U.S.-China strategic rivalry. President Joe Biden certainly thinks that this is a very important piece of legislation if passed. He calls this act an opportunity to show China and the rest of the world that the 21st century will still be the American century. So Qu Qiang, let me ask you this, if I can. What's unique about Joe Biden's American century narrative versus the ones promoted and propagandized by other U.S. presidents? Because virtually all U.S. presidents, put out this concept of, this century or the next century is going to be the American century.
Well, Joe Biden's idea is, you have to understand, after the end of the Cold War, Americans' dominance and American-centric used to be more of the idea of economy. America possessed probably the most favorable position in the world trade and economy, and that's the whole idea. And they think that's good enough because their biggest rivalry, Soviet Union, was not there yet. But right now, for many, many years, like half a century, again, American president had put forward this very ideological saying about American-centric and dominance. You have seen a lot of very political colored issues have been put forward into the package of a trade and economy. Well, just to give you a very interesting anecdote, you see, we're talking about the semiconductors for a very long time, but you have to understand America used to possess the absolute favorable position in the semiconductor industry because their biggest customer and their shipment, 60% of the shipment, is to China. That's to say, we're their customers. China never wants to develop their own semiconductors, and we're paying them lots of money for it, unless one day America decided they have to cut our supplies. So they waged a trade war against China, and now they say we're the competitors. China was forced into the position that we have to produce our own semiconductors. Otherwise, our factories are going to be shut down. And when Chinese factories have been shut down, America's suppliers also will face lots of losses. But why they're still doing this? I think lots of ideology issues has been getting involved. It's more than just a trade issue.
Good points. Sourabh Gupta and Qu Qiang will have to take a short break. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome to the Hub. Back to the Hub on CGTN and Wang Guan. Another $45 billion will be authorized to improve America's supply chain. We've been talking about America's new legislation that has just passed the House. This bill, the $45 billion, will be used to restore a solid supply chain within its borders, according to its stated goals, given its shortage of labor and the inflating economy. And will the federal incentives be enough to have enough American companies to relocate back to the U.S.? How will this bill really help maybe solve or resolve America's current supply chain issues? Qu Qiang.
Well, I don't think this is actually enough incentive. Well, it's not very big enough, nor it's not very focused. Why I say this? America and the rest of the countries that place their value chain and supply chain in China is not only because China has a low cost in the labor, it's because China have a very, very full and wide covering supply chain, doing everything. You can finish everything probably only within one small economic trade zone. So the whole efficiency and the whole security and safety of the supply chain is very, very important. It's actually more than just the cost. If you want to copy and remove everything back into USA, you need to rebuild everything. Just remember, the supply chain doesn't mean only the biggest cake, only the largest, most lubricative benefit, but also, more importantly, you have to have the people, a large fleet of people, workforce to do the dirty job, minor job people wouldn't like to do. You have to put everything into one place. But obviously, in America right now, there are no willingness and political opinion to do so, and no incentive enough to do so. And also, you have to understand there is a wider ranged spectrum inside of America's workforce. On one hand is the Silicon Valley elite workforce. On the other hand is the blue collar, is the traditional workforce. How you can balance their benefit together within one package. And this all need to be rethinked.
Right, revitalizing the so-called Rust Belt workforce has proven to be a challenge not just for Donald Trump, but to Joe Biden. Now, the U.S. bill will substantially increase U.S. federal spending, especially at a time when the U.S. national debt has just hit the $30 trillion mark. That is a 133% debt to GDP ratio. Sourabh, what kind of potential financial pressure will this act exert on the U.S. economy?
I wouldn't say this act in particular would exert too much of financial pressure. You know, the just come in November, December, they were trying to pass the Build Back Better Act. It was a sprawling domestic policy act with child care and loads of other items. That was billed to be $1.8 billion, and that fell through at the end of the day. The sums we're talking about at this point of time are fairly small in comparison. And as I've said, even if I would say, America is at least solvent at this point of time. I'd say to a European country or even to Japan, which have far deeper, far smaller fiscal space, my suggestion would be, if you can make productive investments, make those productive investments. Don't throw money around. And therefore, so long as this CHIPS Act money, COMPETES Act money, USICA money can be put to real long-term productive gain, I think it is a bargain worth having. But again, as I've said, so much money being put into strategic industrial policy when the implementation pipelines are maybe clogged, might not be a very good idea. So overall, stay away from those huge budget bills and do things like USICA and COMPETES Act. But yes, the United States does have fiscal pressure, and it needs to be that much more wiser in spending its money.
Yeah, now I want to talk about the broader China-U.S. relations. As many experts would point out that China-U.S. relations have stopped the previous free fall in the Trump and Pompeo era, but the relationship is nowhere back to its previous pre-2017 level. Before the trade and technology war. Qu Qiang, the U.S. will have its midterm elections coming up, and China is also expected to convene an all-important party congress later this year. How do you think these factors will affect the course of China-U.S. relations in 2022?
Well, in 2022, I'm still an optimist about China and the U.S. relation. This relation is not like before. It's not like the Cold War. It's not actually the conflict of ideology. U.S. and China's relation actually reflected who is going to have a commanding height in the world economy, especially when the economy of the whole world has been slowing down, which means the cake is not getting bigger. So cut the cake become a more important issue right now. So the higher you got, the more favorable position you got, probably the bigger cake you will get. So this is actually the conflict on the benefit. So China is catching up very quickly, and the U.S. have all the reasons to be afraid. But also you have to understand China and the U.S. also has been in a very deep and close bonding of cooperation. China and the U.S. become one of each other's largest trade partners still always, even though we have the conflict and trade war, and we're seeing the momentum has been continuing, especially China has been a great contributor for America's inflation bringing down. You're seeing the prices going up quickly, and USA is more than ever relying on the more affordable supply from China. And with the COVID-19 is going on, the uncertainty goes on, I think this friendship and partnership has to be carried on.
Sourabh, what do you think? Do you share the optimism that China-U.S. relations are somehow manageable in the year 2022?
Yes, in 2022, I don't anticipate much change from 2021, though. And for those who were hopeful that Mr. Biden's coming in would qualitatively shift at least the tone in the relationship, they have been disappointed, and I think that disappointment will last into 2022. After the midterm election, perhaps there might be a slight different position where, depending on the numbers, Mr. Biden finds himself in Congress. I am more positive in terms of the slightly longer term perspective. Here's two reasons for that. First of all, incumbency provides a great deal of power to the president. If Mr. Biden can get reelected, I think there is a real potential opportunities to strike up a stable, coexistential relationship going forward. You know, think back to Obama, think back to Clinton won in 1993, Obama won in 2009. Their first terms were not very good with China. Clinton had all sorts of MFN issues. There was the Taiwan Straits crisis in 1995-96. Li Dangwei went to Cornell University.
Right.
I mean, there was a lot of tension at that point of time. Again, Mr. Obama's first term, he was caught up with a lot of domestic policy because of the global financial crisis. But their second terms, Clinton 2 and Obama 2, were very productive from US-China standpoints. I mean, they talked of strategic cooperation in 1998, and I think at Sunnylands, President Xi and President Obama had a great meeting, and it went off well. And I'm hopeful that Mr. Biden can get his footing. Then in his second term, the relationship can be much better. And I'm also generally more positive. Also, you know, the strategic engagement that Kissinger and Nixon and Chairman Mao provided us, that age is over. But I think the next great opportunity, the great prize, is for that diplomat who can strike up that stable, constructive, coexistent relationship between US and China, which can last for the next 25 years. I think there's a real prize to be had in this regard for a US diplomat or even for a Chinese diplomat, frankly.
Right. Qu Qiang, your predictions on the post-COVID China-U.S. relations. I mean, if the two countries can get COVID behind them at all.
Well, during the COVID-19 and before that, I think the tension is actually the topic between China and the U.S. But considering this, the U.S. need to convert their conflict within the country to some other target outside the country. Understandable, even though we don't quite agree with it. But just think about this. After the COVID-19, what's going to happen? I think the biggest uncertainty has been ended. I think most of the country will going on back on the track of recovery, developing their own economy, stabilize their domestic policies, and etc. So at that time, cooperation and partnership will become, to some extent, the theme between China and the U.S. And I think for the two giants, more than ever, after the COVID-19, we need the stabilization. So I'm still very optimistic towards the two countries, because the two countries are far away from each other. We don't really have anything, the real conflict between each other.
Right.
So I think the conflicts will be temporary, and the cooperation.
You know what,
and
Qu Qiang, I hope
partnership
you're
will be
right.
long.
And sorry to cut you, but that's all the time we have. Thank you so much for joining us, Qu Qiang and Sourabh Gupta in Beijing and Washington, D.C. I'm Wang Guan. Thank you for watching The Hub on CGTN. Our news coverage continues. Bye for now.